Hello, my name is James. This is the first episode of the FALA science fiction, fantasy, horror, fiction podcast. I'm joined by two guests today. Thank you both so much for being here. Could you introduce yourselves?
Hey, I'm James Marquess. Shared name is definitely not going to cause any trouble, but thank you for having me.
I'm Aeka Joshi, no shared name here. Very excited to be here, though.
Thank you. Now, for the first episode of this podcast, I wanted to maybe talk about one of the most famous genres, which is high fantasy. To give a brief definition, it's a subgenre of fantasy that's usually defined by its epic nature of its world building. It's typically set in a fictional universe completely different from ours. Low fantasy would be the opposite of high fantasy. It's stuff like Harry Potter. It takes place on Earth, our world, but it has the sort of inclusion of fantastical elements. Probably the most famous and influential examples of high fantasy is probably J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings book. Basically, it takes place on this fictional world called Middle-earth. It's really famous, but some other examples are Game of Thrones, the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson, and for low fantasy, of course, there's Harry Potter, also plenty of Neil Gaiman and Stephen King books. So yeah, I mean, the reason why I wanted to start with high fantasy for this podcast is because Lord of the Rings is just so influential. To start, what were your first experiences with high fantasy?
Lord of the Rings, like the majority of people listening to this most likely, was my first foray into high fantasy. It was the first high fantasy my parents would let me read because they weren't eager to expose a 7-year-old to George R.R. Martin's love for every possible trigger warning on Earth. Don't get me wrong, Game of Thrones, probably my favorite piece of high fantasy television, and A Song of Ice and Fire is an incomparable piece of historical high fantasy. However, Lord of the Rings was never particularly compelling to me as a child, perhaps because of its distinct lack of characters that I could relate to. Growing up, the South Asian daughter of South Asian immigrants in the U.S., I found it challenging to relate to a lot of high fantasy that was out there at the time because most of it is, shocker, overwhelmingly white. However, it'll always hold a special place in my heart, and I'm very excited to get the opportunity to geek out about it with you guys.
On the other hand, my first was The Hobbit, which you could argue is part of Lord of the Rings. I'm going to say it's its own separate thing, just out of my views. But that is where my first foray into high fantasy is I would have considered Harry Potter high fantasy until I actually started caring about literature, but like the first real one has to be The Hobbit, which I have.
Yeah, for me, I might have watched Star Wars and various other, I guess Star Wars is debatably high fantasy, but I watched maybe various high fantasy films before I actually really got into it. I think I watched Game of Thrones not that long ago, a few years ago, and I was inspired to read the books, A Song of Ice and Fire, and that was really my introduction to high fantasy. Yeah, what were some high fantasy? What are some high fantasy tropes that you like or dislike?
Well, I mean, off the bat, high fantasy is you're going to have your fantasy races. This is going to be your dwarves, your elves, your hobbits or halflings, depending on your universe. Fun fact, D&D is basically all just seeing Lord of the Rings and saying, yeah, let's make that into a tabletop game. And I think the scale of it, assuming it's done well, as was earlier mentioned, world building is essential to high fantasy off the basis that it's usually completely divorced from our world. And I think if it's done well, you can get this wonderful sense of elsewhere. Things I don't like, it can be very, it can rely on its tropes too heavily just from a sheer literature standpoint. It can get so reliant on the elves are the good guys and the orcs are the bad guys, and it doesn't leave gray area, which I think can be a problem.
I mean, already having got political with our very first answer, I'm not scared to do it again. I am bothered by a fair amount of tropes in high fantasy literature, although these are changing rapidly and it's incredibly refreshing to see. I would love to see the bikini battle armor die. Please. Yes, it's very pretty. She's very shiny. But please do not send Daenerys Targaryen to war wearing metal cups over her person. It looks ridiculous. Insofar as tropes I like, I've always been a huge sucker for the Mad Prophet trope, which is probably exemplified before high fantasy was even a glimmer of an idea in ancient epics. The prophet Cassandra from ancient Greek myth comes to mind, and something about the idea of someone not being believed but believing in their own truth is exceptionally compelling to me. And high fantasy, a big part of it is having to set aside your own ideas of what is real and what is good and what is bad. While it is exceptionally black and white, often in our real life we don't find ourselves facing down hordes of orcs or dragons or The Walking Dead. So high fantasy asking us to set aside what is real and to believe in our own truth is such a compelling part of it, and the Mad Prophet trope is probably my favorite for that reason.
Not super familiar with the Mad Prophet trope, but I have to say probably my favorite trope is the redemption arc types of characters. No?
Not here either. I don't think. Yeah.
I don't. Well, it depends on the redemption arc. I like a lot. I think redemption arc too often is you have I like the idea that your protagonist starts as the "are we the baddies" sort of deal, and then they get redeemed way too quickly, and I think that is generally uninteresting. I don't think it's necessarily a bad trope. I just feel like far too often it's like your main character didn't actually do that much that's bad, or they're not thinking about it rationally. That's my issue, but go on.
My own reasoning is drastically different, which is that I tend to get emotionally very attached to characters. You will find me sobbing on the couch after every single death. I'm not even going to bring the dire wolves into this. Spoiler alert. But I feel that redemption arcs are often given, as James said, James Marquess, with a little bit too much sort of cavalierness, so to speak, and they're just sort of handed out like candy, and there's some characters that I struggle to forgive.
That makes sense. I think Jaime Lannister, that's where this is coming from.
I never condemned Jaime in the first place. I couldn't do it. Okay, yes, he made a few mistakes. Our audience who's familiar knows the mistakes to which I refer. But Team Lannister all the way, putting that out there right now, so think of me what you will.
I mean, you were talking about morally ambiguous characters. I think George R. Martin is just really great at.
Moral ambiguity is a fun one. You can have brief sidestep like Warhammer 40k. There is no good characters. It's just who's slightly less evil.
Yes.
I'd say the concept of good and evil is also an interesting one that high fantasy explores in ways that other mediums don't, because high fantasy is exceptionally good at sidestepping blatant, beat you over the head with it allegory, because, thinking in the world of dragons and elves and the undead and whatnot makes it so much easier to understand evil and to understand morality in a way that working in the mediums of the real world just doesn't do.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, I hope to talk about Warhammer later in this podcast.
Some can of worms. But anyhow.
You think there's a lack of diversity in the high fantasy genre?
Yes.
Having jumped the gun here a long time back, I mean, I can really only echo James's answer. Yes. At the same time, I find it interesting because something that gets bandied about a great deal when talking about fantasy in general, be it high fantasy, low fantasy, urban fantasy, or any other genre, is this idea of escapism. And I fail to understand occasionally how escaping from a world in which the projected and perceived norm is, the cishet white male protagonist, how is it escapism to escape into a world in which the norm is, oh, would we look at that, another cishet white male protagonist?
Yeah, I echo that. I'm trying to think of a good universe off the top of my head that doesn't do this, but a lot of it, your main character is going to be generic. Yes, the fantasy world is diverse because you have your orcs and your elves and your dragons and mages and so on, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to actually be that diverse, like primarily being white, for an example, is often happens.
And often, going back to what I said about allegory and metaphor, it's interesting because particularly Lord of the Rings does this in an interesting way, whether it's deliberate or not. Fantasy races often mimic characteristics or stereotypes of those that we see in real life. There are many prevalent and harmful stereotypes about certain ethnic groups that you can see echoed in, the barbaric orc who is never right, or the elf who is, oddly enough, almost always thin and blonde and blue-eyed. And do I really need to add white to the end of that sentence?
Yeah, I mean, as much as I love Tolkien and his contributions to fantasy, I mean, in The Hobbit, with the exception of like a few townspeople mentioned here and there, I think there are literally no speaking female characters in the entire book. In Lord of the Rings, there's Galadriel and Éowyn, maybe a few others, but
there's 2 lines in the movie.
I'd like to speak in defense of Lobelia Sackville Baggins, for The Hobbit, who is, if nothing else, a strong-willed female character. Let's hear it for the Lobelia Sackville Bagginses of the world.
No.
Girl boss, I guess. And another thing that I find interesting, just before we move on from this, is the seemingly completely unself-aware allusions to colonization and the dehumanization that comes with so many traumas suffered by real-life ethnic groups, like slavery, like having your land stolen, like having your culture obliterated. It's just so interesting that fantasy is so blithe about grappling with these issues without once examining perhaps the real-world roots that these come from, because we cannot have complete escapism because we're human and we live, unfortunately enough, in this world.
So, James, you seem to not agree with me that Star Wars is high fantasy.
So, in what nature? Because Star Wars is this funny little can of worms where, on base level, you can look at it and say, oh, that's sci-fi, meaning science fiction, which most definitely fiction. But your opinion is that it is high fantasy.
Yes.
I'm going to disagree and say it's like a sci-fantasy sort of deal, because it is still trying to stay, or not trying to stay within the realm of science, but the spaceships are all powered by fuel. You're having the laser blasters are all powered with lasers. It is not most of the things in the universe are still sciencey in nature. It's aliens, not other races, even if they are other races. It's spread across the galaxy. So I wouldn't consider it a high fantasy.
Okay.
Sheerly on the basis that it is enough sciencey things happening. But I don't think I would ever consider it true sci-fi either.
Yeah, I would, call it a blend between sort of high fantasy and space opera. Now,
Sci-fantasy.
Yeah. Some people consider space opera sort of a subgenre of fantasy. Others consider it a subgenre of sci-fi. I think it's something else entirely, that I can sort of lean either way. But Dune, a story that isn't high fantasy, but that's really similar to Star Wars, of course. I would definitely call that sci-fi.
Definitively. I mean, it's like the father of modern sci-fi.
What are some of the the biggest misconceptions in in high fantasy?
So, misconception number one that I'd like to tackle right out of the gate is the idea of the sorts of people who like high fantasy. Because beyond the assumption that it's all going to be a certain demographic, that it's all going to be, the 16-year-old white kid in his mom's basement drinking ungodly amounts of Mountain Dew, can we please throw that one out forever? Because high fantasy is, for one, it's a valid class of literature. I would love to see literature snobs stop dunking on genre fiction, be that horror, be that sci-fi, be that fantasy. And I would love to see it get recognized for its literary value in addition to its merit as a thing unto itself, which is an incredibly diverse and incredibly wonderful community. Yes, there will be the Mountain Dew pounding, basement dwellers in every community. You're going to find those everywhere. But I would love to once and for all dispel that misconception about high fantasy.
Yeah, I can't think of much other than that. I don't know if there's any particular misconceptions of it. I think a lot of the time you could look at it and say, yeah, that's high fantasy, or that's fantasy at least.
So what are some high fantasy stories that you would recommend?
Oh, I mean, you mentioned it right at the start, Mistborn. It has one of my favorite magic systems of all time, and the descriptions for it, I think Brandon Sanderson, that being the author, is very good at describing how these magic systems work and how they feel to the people using them. I have mixed feelings on how he deals with gods and higher entities, but like the magic system and the world in it is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I really love the Mistborn magic system. It's really fun. Though I wouldn't say I love Brandon Sanderson's writing style.
Yeah, it's not for everyone. I've heard some people who like it, some who don't. I personally don't mind it, and I also think there was a sequel to that series, because it's a 3-book trilogy, and then there's another 3-book trilogy. It takes place like 1,000-ish years after it, which is also very interesting, but you have to get through the first series and see if you like that first.
I think my primary recommendation would be Philip Pullman's Golden Compass, Amber Knife. Goodness, I don't think I have that second one right, but Philip Pullman's Golden Compass series. It's age appropriate for, I think, most all age groups. And it's excellent writing. It's an excellent example of what I would call high fantasy. While there are definitely allusions to groups and places that exist in the real world, they feel distinctly detached and as if they're separate from what we actually have in the real world. Of course, A Song of Ice and Fire, enough said. Moral complexity, blood, gore, guts, we love it. And I can't help it. And although I would caution people against this if you're not a fan of rom-com meets Fae Society, I would give Sarah J. Maas's novels a shot. They have more merit than some might have you believe. They have more literary merit, and of course, one can never really forget the specter that lurks behind this genre, unfortunately, and as it does in most of literature, that Sarah J. Maas's books, like many written by women, are quickly discounted. So I would give them a fair shot.
And other book off the top of my head it's called, what is it? Wise Man's Fear is the second book. It's in The Name of the Wind. That is a pretty fun series. The protagonist is a bit of a Mary Sue, but it doesn't, because of the situations the protagonist is in, he doesn't feel like a Mary Sue. And the world has enough depth in it, as well as I'm blanking on the other, The Gentleman Bastards. That's another series that is really fun. The magic in that series is very whack, very bizarre, but the main characters are you're looking at it from the perspective of two I guess you primarily follow two characters, but it's a group of thieves that are conning people out of their money in all sorts of manner. Again, sometimes even like situations they shouldn't get into, and it is fascinating. Would recommend. Yeah, very, very worthwhile.
If somebody hadn't read high fantasy before, would either of you recommend Lord of the Rings as their first?
I would not. I would not. If someone came up to me, someone who wasn't a fantasy fan in the first place, and said, "Hey, I want to try out high fantasy. Where should I start?" I would point to a Tolkien book, and I would say, "Do you see the other direction? Run."
I don't know. I think the Lord of the Rings books. No, I think The Hobbit is a good intro, but I'm also biased from that's where I started reading it. But it was fun to see that world building and those characters.
The Hobbit is definitely an enjoyable read, although I think it also depends on age group, because I read The Hobbit as a younger child, and I enjoyed it, but I think it might not be the same level of enjoyment for someone who was, say, 16, 17 plus. I would recommend, again, based on age group, starting with someone more accessible. Again, Sarah J. Maas does an excellent job of blending romance genre and other kinds of popular fiction, which I do not use in a pejorative way. Popular does not necessarily mean bad unless you were talking about the series written by Stephanie Meyer that I'm not even going to shame this podcast by naming. But I would recommend starting with someone like Sarah J. Maas or her contemporaries, such as Holly Black, again, another great starting place.
I think a lot of the tropes that Tolkien used are really present everywhere. That I think reading Lord of the Rings, having not read other things, is not going to be super interesting. I think you need context before reading Lord of the Rings, and I just really don't think it's the right place to start.
Yeah, I suppose that makes sense. It is kind of a blend of every bit of high fantasy that you can get your grubby fingers on, so yeah, I can see that.
Thank you so much for having us. As I said earlier, it is an absolute pleasure to get the opportunity to geek out with my fellow lovers of fantasy.
Yeah, no sentiments echoed. I enjoy it, and I like literature, so thank you for having us.
Thank you.